As the U.S. hits the wall on deficit spending and runs out of money, according to one of our guests, can we prevent the next financial crisis? Let's go to it. McArdle, business and economics editor of The Atlantic magazine and fellow at the New American Foundation. Peter Boockvar, equity strategist, Miller Tabak. Vince Reinhart, resident scholar, American Enterprise Institute, and former big Fed head, director of the Fed's monetary division at the board. And Steve Bell, former Senate Budget Committee chief of staff, visiting scholar at the Bipartisan Policy Center. My goodness. Megan, welcome to the program. I'm using your blog about running out of money and hitting the wall on deficit spending. I also want to bring in Alan Meltzer's wonderful piece today in the Wall Street Journal, Preventing the Next Financial Crisis, where he frets about that. There you go. Megan, what are we going to do? And by the way, I'm sure you might have heard the opening. It looks like this government insurance plan's going through, so that's more spending and taxes. Can we prevent the next crisis, Megan?
I'm not sure we can at this point. The political will for either raising taxes or cutting spending just doesn't exist. And when you look at places like New York and California, residents of New York City and places in California, when you add in their state, local, and federal taxes, they already have a tax burden that looks a lot like France. Given that that's where the rich people that we want to tax tend to live, it's hard to see how much room we have for that. But at the same time, there's not much of a political constituency for cutting anyone's spending. And so I think we're in bad shape that way.
And just to close the loop on this, and by the way, you're right, with the state taxes, this 10% tax increase, or 5.5%, you're going to be running up into the mid-50s. That'll be the highest U.S. tax rate in a long time. But Megan, your point, an interesting point in your blog, and I'll get the others to react. We are running the risk of the U.S. of losing our AAA rating on our own government debt, which we are selling, unfortunately, bountifully on a daily basis. Expand on this business about the AAA rating. Nobody else is really talking about that.
Well, you know, the U.S. AAA rating is usually been viewed as so solid that analysts use it as the risk-free rate in their model, as the U.S. Treasury debt. But for a while now, S&P and Moody's have been warning that, you know, this isn't some sort of sacred thing that can't be touched. If the U.S. doesn't get its fiscal house in order, we're going to have to downgrade your debt as a measure of the fact that we think you may have to default. And I think that is a growing worry when you look at deficits going out at 6% of GDP as far as the eye can see. You know, the Bush deficits were bad enough, and I don't want to minimize them. But there's a big difference between running a deficit of 3% of GDP and running one of 6% of GDP. And that's what Obama's projecting in the good years, after we've gotten past the crisis, after we've gotten all of this. Social Security and Medicare are going to be pushing us into a fiscal crisis, and there's no will to do anything about it.
Vince Reinhart, how is this going to affect Federal Reserve policy, all these deficits that Megan's talking about?
Oh, look. We rely on the kindness of strangers. That is, foreign official entities buy a lot of those Treasury securities.
Right.
If they see a path for the Treasury supply as unending, they might start to slow up those purchases. The dollar starts depreciating, and the Federal Reserve, just when it's worried most about the domestic economy, gets a force of external inflation pressures. It's going to be caught between a rock and a hard place.
Well, this is precisely what Alan Meltzer wrote about in his op-ed piece in the morning's Wall Street Journal. Precisely what he wrote about. Now, Steve Bell, I want to come to you, because I know you're also worried about the debt, but I want to spin this a little differently. We have had, Steve, a lot of signs of economic recovery, all right? There's no question about that. GDP is going to go up in the third quarter, I don't know, 3-4%, something like that. It's going to go up for at least the next year. We had very strong home sales reported today. Existing home sales were strong. The leading indicators are very strong. And, of course, the stock market, which lost a little ground this week, has been on a tear for over 6 months. So that's the good news, Steve. Now, let's go back to what Megan is saying and what Vince is saying. How much is this debt, deficits, and pressure on the Fed going to impact economic recovery?
Well, I think it's going to be devastating. I believe this is a liquidity-driven stock market. A lot of people are worried that they're not going to have numbers as good as the general market will have this year. Then they'll lose clients. So I think it's liquidity-driven. Number two, you're going to have inflation. You're going to have some sort of depreciating dollar. And with 49% of our debt now owned by foreign entities, we're getting into a place where most scholars believe there is a serious danger here that our foreign policy, as well as our economic policy, could be, in fact, not prevailing on our own will, but on the will of others who are loaning us the money.
Peter Boockvar, you heard Steve Bell talk about depreciating dollar, the inflation threat, and so forth and so on. Now, once again, I want to emphasize, because I am a near-term optimist on the economy. That's what the data show. That's what the stock market shows. But, Peter, what about your thought here, the anti-Bernanke investment strategy? Does that go hand in hand with what you're hearing from the other panelists?
It does, and we have to look at what got us into this mess. The Fed, in my opinion, their monetary policy, beginning with Greenspan, got this country drunk on credit. And Bernanke's answer to curing that is to provide more alcohol to Americans, to borrow more and print more money. And what's the result? A depreciating dollar, potentially higher commodity prices. We have to defend ourselves from a saving perspective from his policies, because what hurt us is not going to be what cures us. And for some reason, the government is intent on repeating every single mistake of the Japanese.
So what do? Do you buy the inflation stocks? I want a little market wisdom here because, look, we've had a terrific rally. Now, Steve Bell says it's a liquidity-driven rally. I reckon that's probably true. But we've also had better profits, and that includes the recent reports, and most of them have exceeded expectations. So let me ask you, what does an anti-Bernanke investment strategy mean? Which sectors do you buy?
Well, you avoid anything that's reliant on the U.S., over-leveraged U.S. consumer. You buy Asian markets, you buy Latin American markets, you buy commodities, you buy foreign currencies, you buy international debt. Because any rebound in the U.S., well, you can capture that in a much better way outside of the U.S. If the U.S. falters, well, the rest of the world, in my opinion, is going to be much better off than the over-leveraged U.S. consumer and U.S. government and U.S. Financial system is.
All right, we got a lot more work to do. Megan, let me come back to you. Alan Meltzer says in his article today, and I was struck by how close his thinking is with your writing. He says we've got to have a budget limit, some kind of spending limit. And I would add to that, yes, indeed, we should also have a debt limit. But I guess I'm going to ask you a political question, Megan. Is such a thing still possible? I know a lot of people that have given up hope about controlling spending.
You know, I think that the core problem is that no government can commit future governments to doing anything, right? You know, we had PAYGO, they repealed it, they let it lapse. Now the Democrats want to bring it back, but it's not clear they want to bring it back for everything. They may just want to sort of score some of their bills as being deficit neutral for political reasons. So, you know, you've so far, no one wants to cut spending. Everyone wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die.
Right. That's really something. Steve Bell, you know so much about the budget, having been the staff director and so forth, and your great service with Senator Pete Domenici. Why is that? You heard what Megan said. Why does the Republicans don't seem to want to cut spending. The Democrats don't seem to want to cut spending. We had this problem in the last administration. It's getting worse now. Where does that leave us, Steve? What happens here? You need a constitutional amendment? I mean, what happens here? I don't even know what the next step is because I've never seen this before.
Well, I haven't either. I remember when I used to worry about telling senators that we had a $100 billion deficit, 5% or 4.5% of GDP. We're now at 10% of GDP. And the best calculations I can do based upon political judgment and probably economic adjustments is that we're going to have about a $21 trillion debt, not $17 trillion as the Obama administration projects, in about 9.5 years. And here's the reason it is almost set in concrete and why I don't think Congress can cope. We have 77 million people going to join the over 65 ranks in the next 10 years. They voted in very large numbers and historically have always done so. So are you going to tell them, well, listen, we're going to means test Medicare. We're going to cut back on how much we give you in Social Security. We are, in fact, not going to be able to do the things we said under Part B plans of Medicare.
How about the $500 billion Medicare cut that's part of this government insurance option?
3 words. Not going to happen.
Right. Where's the? All right. Can we avoid the next financial crisis? That was a great op-ed today from Alan Meltzer of Carnegie Mellon University, and we have a distinguished panel to discuss it. Megan McArdle, Peter Boockvar, Vince Reinhart, Steve Bell. I got to go to my friend Vince. Look, I noticed the Fed's balance sheet has started growing again the last couple of months. It's now over $2 trillion. It's about 60% at an annual rate since July. And Alan Meltzer's piece said there's now $1 trillion of idle reserves sitting at the Fed for money that's unused. Now, that is a lot of unused inflationary potential power, Vince. Explain this to me. How does the Fed work out of this?
Okay, so the balance